It's official. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. Before I get to the panel, I do want to quickly thank the organizers of this event. So Carolyn McLeod, Luke Stark, Jackie Burkell, and Emily Chihotsky from the Rotman School of Philosophy at Western. This event has been a long time coming from my perspective anyway. We've been planning it for a while. I'm so excited to have everybody here, including you all, of course. Okay, so I'll start by saying that this afternoon, I filled out a survey from the Ottawa Public Library, where I'm from, asking me what different roles I thought public libraries performed. And I was able to select as many as I wanted. It was a long list. So I selected things like, well, they're places for people to gather. They're sources of information. They spark curiosity. They're essential for childhood education. I used to bring my kids to the library all the time to learn about things and get books, stacks and stacks of books. They offer cultural programming. They promote healthy community and much more. So libraries really are amazing institutions. They help protect privacy. I learned that years ago when I was working on privacy with a good friend of mine. And I'd like to thank the London Public Library for hosting us all tonight for this public gathering in which we'll learn new things about a very hot topic, artificial intelligence regulation. So tonight, our curiosity will be sparked. I'm sure we'll walk away with much richer for having heard our wonderful panel talk about the work that they do and how it relates to the topic of tonight's panel. Can we enhance AI trustworthiness through regulation? So why are we here to talk about AI trustworthiness and regulation? I want to do a quick poll in the room. So by show of hands, I want to ask, how many of you have used AI? Does everybody have their hand out? I feel like there are a couple of things. So I'll just point out how widespread AI really is. If you've ever used a grammar or spell checker in Word or on your phone, if you've ever used Siri or Alexa, the adaptive cruise control or lane keep assist features in your car, if you've used ChatGPT or DALL-E, if you've used the camera on your phone, any social media platform, TikTok, Facebook, you name it, then of course you've used AI. How many of you trust that AI is being developed for the betterment of humanity? I see a maybe and
it is developed to say currently what it is developed for, and what it has become. Those are two different things.
Okay, so this is a good philosophical distinction. And finally, how many of you think AI is trustworthy? Oh, a different hand. Okay, all right. Okay, well, in prepping for this panel, I thought I'd turn to AI for its thoughts on AI regulation. So of course, I do what everybody's doing these days. I posed the panel topic to ChatGPT. So I asked it, can we enhance AI trustworthiness through regulation? And I'm going to read you what it said. And to its credit, it had a pretty good answer. So it said, I'll paraphrase a little bit. It was a little bit longer than this, but just bear with me. So regulation can play a significant role in enhancing the trustworthiness of AI systems. Here's how. Regulating AI can help us establish ethical frameworks for developing and using AI, establish transparency requirements to make AI more understandable, improve data privacy to ensure personal information is handled more responsibly and securely, establish liability, holding developers and users accountable for the actions and decisions of AI, expose biases to mitigate harmful and discriminatory outcomes, establish clear safety standards in critical domains like autonomous vehicles and healthcare, and finally, establish oversight and enforcement mechanisms to accomplish all of the above. However, says ChatGPT, achieving the right balance is essential. Over-regulation can stifle innovation, while under-regulation can lead to AI systems with unintended consequences. It's important for regulations to be flexible, adaptive, and informed by ongoing technological advancements and ethical considerations. Additionally, international collaboration on AI regulation is crucial, as AI often operates across borders. Finally, and I'm about to wrap up on ChatGPT anyway, it told me that finding the right balance is a complex task and requires ongoing dialogue among governments, industry stakeholders, experts, and the public. So that's not bad. It's a pretty good answer. I'll just thank ChatGPT for writing a large portion of my intro for this panel. That makes my life a lot easier. I promise it didn't write the questions we'll be asking and discussing with the panelists, and I'll leave it to them to tell you if they used it to write their answers. However, ChatGPT got a lot of things right, including the complexity of striking the right balance when regulating AI or technology for that matter. If ChatGPT could see us here tonight, I think it would agree we have exactly the right mix of people on our panel to have this conversation. We have representatives from government, industry, experts, and you, the public. So, joining me on the stage, well, up front tonight, we have Susan Lindsay, who goes by she, her. Susan is counsel at the Law Commission of Ontario, where she leads the AI and Civil Justice System project. She is principal author of the Law Commission of Ontario's report, Accountable AI, and she also runs the LCO's joint initiative on AI and human rights with the Canadian Human Rights Commission. The latter involves the design of a human rights AI assessment tool for developers and administrators of AI systems. We also have Vanessa Thomas, who goes by she, her, and they. Vanessa is Senior Advisor of Technology Review with the National Security and Intelligence Review Agency's Technology Directorate at the Government of Canada. They conduct technical investigations of digital systems, draft reports that explain advanced and novel technical subjects, and assess the risks associated with various IT systems, including ones that employ automated decision-making, or AI. Finally, we have Anthony D'Amato. Anthony comes to us tonight from Ford Motor Company. Anthony is the Chief Engineer of Advanced Driver Assist Systems Component and Systems Engineering at Ford Motor Company. For those of you who don't know, advanced driver assist systems are things like adaptive cruise control or lane keep assist, stop sign detection, things like that. Systems that use AI to help drive a car. Accurate?
Correct.
All right.
AI is part of that.
AI is a piece.
Ecosystem.
Yeah. So Anthony's various roles in research engineering at Ford Motor Company focus on autonomous vehicle systems and advanced driver assist systems, including the safety and regulatory compliance of such systems. So all of our panelists today have experience with AI, have some experience with regulatory environments. AI may or may not fall under today, but will likely fall under in the future. So they're a perfect panel to be having this conversation. I'd like to now get on to the discussion. My plan tonight is to ask a few questions of the panel, then we'll open the floor to questions at around 7:45, give or take. I'd like to keep the conversation as informal and as accessible as possible to all of you and to all of us up here, coming from different backgrounds. So I might jump in to get you to clarify technical terms, and if anyone has a question about a technical term, just throw your hand up if you don't understand something, and maybe we'll get some clarification. I find that that's important. And I'll encourage you all to feel free to jump in as we discuss, to just have a conversation with one another. Just quickly, I completely forgot to introduce myself. I'm Jason Miller. I'm a professor at the University of Ottawa. I have a Canada Research Chair in the Ethical Engineering of Robotics and AI. I've been studying ethics of robotics and AI for over a decade. And I'm very happy to be moderating this panel of such interesting and expert individuals in their own domains. So let's start by having each of you introduce your work in a bit more detail, and in a minute or two tell us how your work intersects with or involves the use of AI, and whether or how the AI in your work affects trust, and whose trust does it affect. And why don't we just start here and then move our way down the table.
Sure. I thought my intro was actually quite good. So as Jason mentioned, I'm the chief engineer for within the ADAS domain, so advanced driver assistance systems at Ford Motor Company. You mentioned components and systems. What this entails is all the external sensing and internal sensing for the vehicle. So cameras, radars, in the future lidars that are externally facing, observing the environment, picking up objects, things generally that we don't want to run into. Lane lines to enhance driving, for example, and then more recently, driver-facing cameras as well too, to see if the occupant is paying attention when they're using the systems and to make sure that they're not abusing them, right? So as it relates to AI, this comes in, intersects my work, I would say on a daily basis. Some of the more rudimentary features that I think people take for granted that are operating in the vehicle, so automatic emergency braking, for example, the driver-facing cameras I just mentioned are examples that use AI that are probably not immediately obvious to most drivers. within that domain now, we're also moving to more advanced systems where we are taking responsibility away from the driver and moving into the automation. And this brings in a whole new level of safety and regulatory type of concerns in terms of advancing to the level of saying that you truly don't need to pay attention in the vehicle. So those are familiar with the SAE levels of automation. I'm referring to making that leap from level 2, which is a Blue Cruise or a Tesla Autopilot type feature, to something where you truly don't need to pay attention into the level 3 and level 4 domains. And those would be examples like Cruise and Waymo operating out west. So, thank you.
Great.
Okay. Hi, I'm Susie. I'm a lawyer, legal representative, I think, on this panel. The Law Commission is a true commission. Our job is to make recommendations for law reform. So we do a lot of research and a lot of consultation. Our work is multidisciplinary, and I spend a lot of time talking to everybody. And in AI, that involves industry, academics, corporate compliance officers, data scientists, government policy people, and my work started really by looking at government use of AI. So when government decides that they want to use an AI system to help help making decisions over who should qualify for social benefits, or who should be audited for taxes, and various government services that are deployed, there are a number of laws that are applied in that context, and the work I initially did was looking at those gaps, and that led to the report that Jason referenced, really the areas of law being privacy, human rights, and procedural fairness. Coming out of that, we saw a real gap in conversations about human rights law. We well established, understood that AI systems are biased, and trying to figure out when that bias is harmful. And there have been lots of conversations about that, and not a lot of conversations about where the law is, how the law applies, and where the gaps are and how we move forward in this space. So that's where my work is now. And the question about this panel is, can we enhance trustworthiness through regulation? My answer, to surprise to nobody, is yes, or at least we have to try. Because I'm working with the two human rights commissions, Ontario and federal, to actually design an assessment tool to assess AI for human rights. So I definitely fall into the camp that we have to try and get there.
Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Vanessa Thomas. Like Jason said, I work for the National Security and Intelligence Review Agency. I'm going to just give you a little bit of detail about that because it's such a small agency and a new agency. I don't think many people know what it is. We are the independent review body for Canada's National Security and Intelligence Agency. That's CSIS, that's CSE, that's the Department of National Defense, RCMP as well. I could keep listing a bunch of acronyms, but our agency is responsible for reviewing their programs, technologies, services, plans for the future, all of those activities that they get up to. And I'm on the technology team, which is involved with nearly every review. We actually get to go into the details of the technologies that these agencies use. And I came to NCIRA from the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, where I also did similar work on their Technology Analysis Directorate. So I bring a lot of technical background and technical skills. I initially trained as a computer scientist and then sort of branched out and learned a bunch of other things, just because I'm a squirrel sometimes. I'm a non-binary settler from Treaty 6 territory, which is what's currently known as Edmonton. So I grew up with a fusion of things influencing my interests, and I brought that to sort of the training that I got before joining the federal government. So how does my work intersect with AI? As you may not be surprised to know, our national security and intelligence agencies use automated decision-making systems in some of what they do. For security reasons, will not be able to talk about a lot of the details of those specific systems. But I will try to draw some examples from when I was at the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, which, I mean, for example, I was the technical lead on the Clearview AI case, which was used by the RCMP, so I might speak to that a little bit as we go to the debate. If I need an example of AI that's in the public domain. How does all of this intersect with trust? I think everybody will have their own opinion on that, how trust how trustworthy are our national security and intelligence agencies, and how much do you trust their use of automated decision-making systems? I'm not going to tell you the answer to that. I certainly feel like our role is there to enhance people's understanding of what these agencies do. We do have public reports available, especially when focused on biometrics at the border, which you can all go and read. It's been mostly declassified, so it's a good read, and I hope that our work contributes to enhancing trust in public institutions, but whether or not that relates to trust in the systems, I can never tell, and I'm not sure that I want to enhance the trust in the systems. I might be a vocal proponent for enhancing distrust in these systems. Let's see how the conversation goes.
So if we have to regulate AI, does the institutions you work with also have to follow these regulations as well, or is this just for me?
I love that you asked that. Funnily enough, I'm not sure how many people know, there's a whole bunch of rules that do apply to the data that's collected by these systems, as well as the government of Canada has released something called an algorithmic impact assessment and recently a guide on generative AI, but there are national security exemptions for these things. So a lot of the organizations that we review do not have to adhere to those rules that other agencies have to adhere to. So they've got their own rules, which do have to be, their projects have to be vetted in front of the federal court. There are a lot of other sort of constructs in place, but they're different than the AI things that apply to like Transport Canada and the Canadian Digital. So I love that you asked that. There are national.
Yes, great question. Yes, it was in the list of questions. I'll scratch that out. Well, that's great. And so, Vanessa, you talked about trust and trustworthiness specifically, and who you're concerned about, I guess, the public, or at least that the government's, from the government's perspective, who is the focus of like making, well, AI more trustworthy through the kind of work that you do. So I'm kind of curious where you land on this, Tony and Susie. In your work, like who is it most that you're thinking about when you think about AI and trustworthiness or trust? And even like what is, I'm kind of curious to know if we were operating on the same concepts of trust or trustworthiness. I don't expect you to have a definition for these things, but just talking off the cuff, like I'm kind of curious what you think trust or trustworthiness means in the context of your work. Susie went first.
Oh boy, okay. I mean, trustworthy AI has become a bit of a buzzword, and the idea, I think, around the world, countries and jurisdictions have been scrambling, and I think I've said this before, that everyone and their cousin has a list of ethical AI principles. And if you look at the EU principles, the US blueprint principles, Ontario's beta principles, there's a lot of overlap and a lot of similarity, and I think they're all leading to developing trustworthy AI. So, for example, having human oversight, humans involved in the development of AI, in the oversight of AI, focusing on privacy and data governance, focusing on transparency, focusing on diversity and non-discrimination, and all these different components that lead to trustworthy AI. I think a lot of it is protecting the individual, but so much of the regulations and the principles focus on the designers and developers. We haven't made a lot of progress in individuals having a redress against an AI system. So although we're looking at protecting individuals from harm, protecting communities from harm, a lot of the focus is what are developers doing, what are designers doing.
Right.
So that in terms of it
So
gets
we're on the sort of a path to trustworthiness in addressing the ways that developers and designers are doing their work, but we need to add, you're saying like that there's a missing piece about the redress that individuals might have, or that could contribute to trustworthiness.
Yes, I think there's trying to make AI accountable so that people rely on it is a bit different than the general public's perception of what AI is.
Right.
And I think large industry would say, we want people to trust what we're doing with AI. And we know they're reading the news and they're seeing all these horrible things. And, my 90-year-old mother is like, oh my God, what's happening with AI? And they want to know, how can we actually educate people to trust AI? And that's, I think, coming from it. We want to sell them products. We want to offer a service where AI is sort of coming from a different place than we want to, make sure there are systems in place to make sure AI that's being developed is accountable.
Right. Great. And Tony, I mean, the auto industry has a lot of AI on the roads already, right? Like this is an area, I don't know that, most people think of those systems as containing AI, but I'm just like wondering if you have a sense of how people are talking about trustworthiness in the automotive industry when it comes to deploying those types of systems.
Well, I think we think about this in a very different way than maybe the media has presented it recently. So there are two groups of people that we.
Speak up just slightly.
No one has ever told me that before, so I appreciate it. I have no problem speaking. Is that better if I at that volume or? So there are two groups of people that we're generally concerned about, at least within our domain, right? So there is the user experience, so the customer that has purchased our vehicle or is inside the cabin that we want to have them have trust in our brand, not necessarily in AI itself, but in Ford Motor Company delivering a quality product and an experience. AI may be tied to that, but at the end of the day, this is about a feature that they're experiencing where AI is a singular part of this within that pipeline that's delivering that experience to them. The second group of people is the general public, people around the vehicle, other road users. How are they interacting with our vehicle? When we have automation on, how should they be behaving in the presence of a vehicle that's not necessarily being driven by a human being? The way that's typically been regulated in the automotive space is not on the individual components that comprise a feature. It is on the application itself. So if I'm going to offer an emergency braking feature, I'm going to regulate the outcomes of that device. So for example, under these scenarios, I expect it to perform in this way, or I expect it to not fire when it should not activate, for example, and it's not specific to the technology that drives that. And I'm going to argue that that's why it should not be regulated, because I don't want to be restricted. When I say I, it's the corporate I in this case, regulated in terms of how we achieve certain outcomes. So these same features were initially offered without AI. We find great enhancements to them by including these technologies. We can expand the use cases, we can expand the operation when we can make smart decisions about what other objects in the environment there are. And that's probably the main application of AI in the automotive space. It's digesting camera data, figuring out what's in that scene. So with the more traditional components, I can tell where things are. I can tell if they're moving, but I have no sense of what they are necessarily or how they might move in the future without having more context that I can use AI to help determine. Please.
Yeah, jump in,
I
please.
think across the three of you, you've actually picked out layers of trust here. So, I mean, we have already been trusting automated systems that are in our cars that we didn't know were there. In the same way that lots of us have trusted Google Maps because of the user experience providing us with something that isn't really difficult for us to engage with, and it provides us better routes, say, than we might have come up with on our own. There's this trust that comes from the user experience that Tony was just mentioning. There's the trust that comes from all the testing that goes into these systems, and if you can demonstrate that these systems have actually been tested, which if you know much about how these systems are developed and then can be tested, you want to question if you can trust the data that's been used to train these systems. And then there's this other layer that Susie's talking about as well, which is about trusting the ways that we present people with information, the sort of marketing around these tools, the legislation and the regulations that go around guiding the development of these tools as well. I think even just talking amongst us, we're picking out layers of trust. And I feel like that is part of what makes the topic of this panel so interesting, because how do you regulate all of those layers? Do you want to?
And what's the connection between the regulation and the trustworthiness or the trust that people have in these systems? So talking about those regulations, there are governments everywhere that are proposing, they have proposed regulations. I don't know that there are like a lot of enacted regulations, but certainly a lot on the being proposed. So in Europe, we have the EU's AI Act. In the US, we have the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. Here in Canada, we have Bill C-27, which includes the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act. So I'll pose this question, and Susan, maybe you're the most appropriate person to start with. So, in thinking about all these emerging acts, regulations, maybe you can even clarify that. I'm wondering, like, what are the gaps or concerns with AI specifically that would warrant this kind of regulation, and maybe even talking about what the role of regulation is to clarify that?
Little question.
Yeah, a little question. No, just like explain regulation to
I'll
everybody here.
I'll take a step back and say that we're we're not operating in a Wild West. Like, this is not a lawless land, right? We have an established legal system, and there are existing laws that AI is subject to. So, we have privacy legislation, we have human rights codes, we have a charter, we have a whole, years of liability and negligence analysis and product liability. So the first part to start with is where are the gaps? So when Anthony mentions not wanting to be regulated, it probably depends in what context and what Ford is doing, but from the safety perspective, you've got years of being regulated on the safety of how you build your vehicle. So there's already a regulatory structure and a legal structure in place there, and the question is, does something need to change? Does AI change the way that you already do things? From a very, very big picture perspective, our legal system is set up as a form of correcting wrongs that have happened. Something goes wrong and someone gets sued, right? What are the damages? How much does someone have to pay? And it's a model that's kind of in hindsight. And in the human rights context, someone makes a complaint to the Human Rights Tribunal, or they go to court, and they have to sort of look in the rearview mirror and say, was that discrimination? And they could spend 10 years deciding if it was discrimination or not, right? So the problem comes with AI is these laws exist, and these systems are being and will be litigated. They will be taken to court. There are lawsuits over them. That'll continue. The reason why regulation comes into play is, let's think about some of these issues when we're writing our ideas on the back of an envelope. Right at the beginning, when we're sort of thinking about the design of an AI system, let's start thinking about, are there going to be any human rights issues? And it's sort of an ex ante, get me using silly Latin words, but sort of ex ante as opposed to ex post approach. One of the problems with litigation with AI is litigation is costly, it's complex, it's not available to everybody. One of the hallmarks of AI systems is their opacity. We can't always understand what's happening in them. So if you think of someone trying to sue, say a company or an organization that's used AI, they have to know that the AI was used. And there's tons, we already have been told it's being used in ways we don't know, right? There's lots of disclosure issues where we don't know it's being used. And then even if we do know the AI is being used, we have to, as a person bringing the lawsuit, there's a lack of transparency into what actually happened. And then you have to get access to the data that the system was trained on, and there's some privacy issues there. And then it raises trade secrets, because who really wants to share their secret sauce, right? A lot of companies don't. And this ends up being costly. And so to try and think of, let's try and avoid having these things go to court and fought over. Let's try and think of some of these problems before they start. And actually, a lot of AI systems won't have huge human rights issues, but just think about it from the beginning, raise the question along the way, and let's try and avoid having harm down the road. So that's my sort of big picture as to why regulation can be helpful in the AI context. I've forgotten the rest of your question in terms of work.
No, that's great. That's great.
I can talk about sort of themes that are evolving or where the direction regulation is going and that kind of stuff. I don't know if that was part of your question.
Yeah, I mean, it was a question that I had that was coming up. I'm kind of curious to hear your take, Tony.
I definitely had a rebuttal formulating.
I know you came here specifically. So
I am representing my own opinions for the record. I work at Ford Motor Company, but everything I share tonight is my personal opinion, just for the record. Especially now that I know who I'm sitting next to here. But I'm kidding. I guess the question in my pushback on this is that, at least in the engineering discipline, why would we jump to regulation? Why wouldn't we look to existing standards and engineering practices to ensure safety of these systems, right? I mean, AI is just another technological tool that we use to achieve an outcome. We have ways of assessing hazards and safety issues associated with deploying new technologies, and that's exactly what we do currently. So an AI that is attached to the motion control system of a vehicle is treated very differently than an AI that's used for voice recognition for mapping, for example. Because when the mapping's wrong, you might get annoyed. When the motion control version of the AI is wrong, people potentially can be hurt, right?
I think it depends what the harm is you're looking at and what you're doing. So I believe what you're talking about is safety. And you can correct me because you know a lot more about the auto industry than I do. But my understanding is that auto industry is now entering into the realm where you may have issues with privacy and you may have issues with discrimination, and that if you're designing cameras that are monitoring the driver's face while they're driving, and they're monitoring it differently depending on the color of someone's face, or you're trying to assess whether someone's falling asleep while they're driving, and you have a different outcome, that's a different issue than safety issues that have always existed in cars, and AI sort of changes a bit. Same with privacy issues in the sense of if the automobile industry now has access to where people go all the time, right? And if police are wondering, they want to find a car and they want to, and you know, what happens with that information you have. And historically, the auto industry hasn't had access to all that data. I don't know what you do with the data. I don't know, but those are new questions that are a bit different than the design of a self-driving car. Right?
So to that end, I mean, privacy is a very interesting topic, at least in the US, I can comment. There is, pending regulation that is coming within the PII front, but that is not specific to AI. It is exactly what you were alluding to. What do we do with that information that we're gathering? Which we are gathering at the end of the day, right? I mean, we do take PII very seriously. That's person identifiable information. We do protect that. We use it to enhance features for safety. We're not generally in the business of doing anything else with it, but that's where I'd like to see it regulated, is at the end application, not in terms of how it was collected, for example.
I do. Vanessa, did you
Give
want
you a
to
hard
jump
time.
in? I also want to jump in
Yeah.
and just push back a little.
Yep.
So I'm going to push back a little bit, specifically on some of the points you raised about safety. So, and I'll just sort of channel some of the objections that I've heard over the years, and just to get your reaction to that. So, with more and more complex systems being used to control the vehicle, speed up, slow down, keep inside the lane, even make lane changes at times, maybe, depending on what type of vehicle.
That is accurate with
with
Ford's
yours
cars.
currently.
Yes.
Okay, all right. Well, I don't own a Ford, so I won't get into that.
We'll discuss that
It's got
afterwards.
nothing
But
to do with my question is this: so people will push back and say, look, you'll often hear people say it's very difficult, maybe impossible, to test these systems in a way that you would know that they are going to operate, say, as good as the average driver or better, because it's very difficult. The systems are kind of black boxes. You don't really know how they're going to respond in corner cases or whatever. So the comment I hear oftentimes is like it's kind of impossible to test these things to that level. So we'll never know whether they're safe or not. That's the criticism I want you to respond to, because you hear it a lot, right?
sure, I mean, it's a fair question. And so within the current paradigm of features that we offer, humans are still supervising the technology. So the way we answer that question specifically, which is totally accurate, with a black box system that I can't fully understand exactly what's happening within, I need to wrap a monitor around it at the end of the day. So I can check the outputs of the system. I can check to see if they're plausible. Am I asking for an acceleration or a lateral control that is outside of the realm of reasonableness? And then most importantly, if I'm relying on the human as my ultimate safety factor in this case, I need to make sure I'm not requesting something that makes it impossible for that driver to intervene. So for example, if I'm going to take the driver out of a lane, I'm always going to make sure that I do that with an amount of control that allows them to put their hands back on the wheel and intervene in the case that the vehicle is not doing something that it should. And this is to protect exactly for what you're mentioning for these corner cases.
So the driver is the fallback in the safety case for
The driver
types of
is the
systems.
safety case.
The driver is the safety system.
Absolutely.
These are something else.
For what we talked about, SAE level 2 systems that are,
Right.
These are what are on the road right now. There is no mistaking this, right? You cannot go to sleep as the automation is driving. You need to be paying attention. And that's why we have cameras that are looking at you to make sure that you're doing what you should be, and that's looking at the road.
Okay.
Can I just also say that, so my background in computer science is something called human-computer interaction. You probably know it more commonly as user experience design or human-centered design. Our whole field for the last 3 decades has been grappling with that exact criticism that it's impossible to test systems, digital systems, for all scenarios that they could possibly encounter. And I would say that we've now seen plenty of examples of automated decision-making systems, whether that's Facebook's automated news recommendation feed, putting certain types of content in front of people, whether that's YouTube radicalizing folks by recommending certain types of content, whether that's Pokemon Go, sending people on routes that they would have never otherwise gone on. We see lots of technologies with very different applications and in very different spaces not being able to predict sort of how they will be used. And shifting, again, in my field, we did this thing where only previously we used to test in labs for cases that we could conceive of, and then we went into the wild, which is such a garbage phrase. But we went and started testing technologies out in sort of everyday use case scenarios, and we still couldn't conceive of all of the different ways that these technologies could be used and exposing people to different risks. And I'm with Tony in a way on trying to think about how different applications of automated decision-making systems need different types of regulation because of how different they are when they're out there, and the harms that can be caused by a self-driving car are just as real as the harms that can be caused by Facebook, but the actual implementation of the digital systems, the recommendation systems underpinning Facebook, is quite different than what's underpinning the sensors in the cars, and to try to apply the same set of regulations to those feels a little misguided technically.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to pick up on this. So when the way that we're talking about AI regulation right now is with these large acts, kind of umbrella acts that cover everything. AI, right? Is that the proper way to start, or do we need to drill down and get much more specific in the regulations? Like, are these regulations that are being proposed even capable of doing the things that we think people would need in order to make AI more trustworthy?
Well, I can so there's a few themes emerging in AI regulation, and one big picture question is, can we get where we want to go? And I would say that internationally there's a lot of consensus on these principles of how we want, which is a really good thing, right? People want transparency, they want privacy to be respected, they don't want these systems to be biased, they want them to be safe, they want them to be accountable, and of course the devil is in the details and how we actually figure that out. So it's a question of, can we get there through laws that are debated in the House of Commons and take a fair bit of time to actually come to be? And then once we have a law and legislation on the books, they can create regulations that attach to that legislation. Those are a little easier to change, a little easier to amend, but they often come with some enforcement powers, right? There may be criminal, there may be civil, some sort of penalty. And I think that goes to enhancing trust. If you can trust a system because, if something goes wrong, there'll be some sort of enforcement. But that's sort of one aspect of regulation. Then there's the guidelines, the standards, the policy, and more self-regulation. And can we get where we need to go through that means? And this is sort of an ongoing conversation in the regulatory context. And really what's happening is it's all necessary. So we're seeing, there's massive conversation with standards. And standards can be updated and they can be changed and they can be very specific to an industry, right? And that's really important to have. Standards typically are an optional opt-in thing, right? And in a lawsuit, if you don't adhere to the industry standards, that could hurt your chances of not being liable. But this debate over sort of what kind of regulations we need. We're also seeing, so that's one theme, this do we need hard rules or do we need soft law? And another one is we have, Jason's referred to these broad sweeping forms of legislation that EU, China, Canada, the US are all in draft form trying to, the EU's way ahead of everybody else. They're probably about to release it, but that's sort of one element. Then we see all these fragmented little laws and legislation showing up. And I mean that in that they're more specific, I shouldn't say little. And some of it's by deployer. So the federal government has created this federal directive. If any department of the federal government, not national security, who is subject to Treasury, they have to abide by that law. Then we see it by use of AI. So in New York, they have a law saying, if you're an employer and you're going to use AI to assess who should get the interview, who should get the promotion, that AI system has to go through these steps. It's subject to this legislation. And then like 20 different municipalities in the US have, so that's a specific use of AI. Then there's specific technology, and there's a whole bunch of propping up all over the place like generative AI, lots and lots of sort of guidelines and lots of self-regulating generative AI. And then a whole bunch of municipalities in the US have just outright banned facial recognition technology. So they're regulating the specific technology.
The application.
Yeah, it depends on how the law is written.
Just to clarify, the generative AIs,
Oh,
things like ChatGPT, DALL-E, the ones that can create art, create music, create deep fake videos and audio, things like that. Just a technical point.
Yeah, no, that's good. And not to keep blabbing forever, but we also see sectoral things where the Toronto Police Service has their own internal policy for when their officers, when they want to use AI, what they have to do. The RCMP is developing their own. So I think it's very sectoral specific, and it's really hard to come up with these sweeping laws. I think we will likely see a lot of overlap, and that we will see double regulation, which will no doubt frustrate a lot of people, and we'll see gaps. You know, if ADA, the federal act, comes out, there'll be lots of questions as to what it doesn't cover and who isn't subject to it. So.
It sounds like we're talking about something very specific in this framework of adding regulation, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on this. So, I mean, AI is, as we were talking before this panel started, is a bit of a loaded term in a sense of when does a learning algorithm rise to the level of AI? And is it when you're doing something in terms of privacy and recognition of people at the end of the day? And I guess what complexity level do we have to cross, in which case then there is a trust issue that we need to address? Like, I think of one of the first applications within the automotive space was in terms of fuel management. So anybody that's taken algebra, you have an equation for a line. You have mx plus b. I'm sure those are familiar from your high school classes. And it was identifying the m and the b in your parameterization in real time. I mean, there's no person identifiable information. It's incredibly simple. And is that something that needs to be regulated?
So you totally hit the nail of a major issue in regulation, and that is I have yet to see any draft or existing regulation that has the same definition of AI. Like everywhere, it's a different
I was going to
definition.
ask you to define AI, but I felt that was really unfair because I know that this is just impossible right now. Yeah.
So the first challenge is what technology is actually captured, right? Which for a lawyer, definitions are pretty important. You want to know what we're talking about, but also for industry to know whether they're regulated. What we're seeing is, at least in Canada and the EU, is a risk-based model. So the regulations are focusing on what risk the AI system poses. And I say that with what does that mean? Well, there's lots of debate, right? So the most obvious example is AI used in the criminal justice system, where you're talking about someone's fundamental freedoms, and if the courts are going to use AI to assess whether someone has a likelihood of reoffending, and it will go to whether they get bail or not, that's something that they're like, okay, we're going to have a bit more scrutiny over these systems because there's some pretty big, important stuff happening. If it's a little chat bot that pops up in your Microsoft Word, I don't know, does that, so there's sort of the prime example in government services is if the government builds an AI system to decide what campsite you get. No one really seems to care about if that AI system works well or not, or if it has privacy.
I mean, I can't ever seem to get a campsite, so I kind of care.
But I mean, so it depends. It's a sliding scale of, are you in the context of something that needs to be regulated? And that is heavily debated right now as to whether you're in that context or not. And that's the route Canada seems to be going. If you're high impact, all these regulations attach. And that's
the thing that went through my head was that my family are a bunch of nerds, and over Thanksgiving, my dad shared his favorite AI book, which was an AI in the Commodore 64 book from 1984. And what counted as AI during those times is substantially different than what would count as AI now. And of course, AI is just a big umbrella marketing term for a lot of technologies that can be making decisions in an automated way, if you can consider them to be making decisions. But I feel like one of the things I took from working at the Office of the Privacy Commissioner was that we in Canada have had really technology neutral laws and regulations to this point. And some of the conversations I'm hearing around regulating AI seem to be taking us away from that and trying to be like quite technology prescriptive, in fact. So I just thinking about the spectrum of what is counted as AI over the years and the slow nature of changing laws in Canada, I think it'll be interesting to see what actually comes out in C27 after this next round of revisions and how it affects our conceptions of what AI is these days. Yeah.
Well, I think it's time to turn the questions to the floor. Before I do that, I'll just point out that because we're recording, in order to capture the questions, I'm going to need to give you this. So I'm going to get up and walk around. How many, can I, just by show of hands, who has some questions that they want to ask right now? Perfect. So I'll just start making my way around. And if you could just take the mic, if you're comfortable, you can introduce yourselves and then ask your question. Speak loudly enough that they can hear you at the front. Sorry, can you put your hands up again? Okay, I'm going to ask you to put your hands up a bunch of times.
Thanks for this discussion. It's been really cool. My name is Tristan Getz. I teach ethics of engineering at Cornell. And as someone who's in that position of trying to get future engineers to think about what their responsibilities are to society and what kinds of professional rules they should be following, I'm curious about that kind of like underside of regulation, where in the absence of specific rules for people to follow, what kinds of skills or dispositions do you feel we need to inculcate in future technologists and current technologists so that they're making responsible decisions even when the law isn't telling them you must do this, you must not do that?
I mean, I'm taking a break this semester, but I've been teaching at Carleton University in the School of IT, a third-year class actually dealing with teaching computer scientists how to think through these messy sort of ethical and social issues that emerge in technologies. And I just force them to go through activities that challenge them with ideas that they otherwise might not have had to think through. So I was telling Jason and Susie about this one activity over dinner where I used to have my students, who all come from very different backgrounds, come up on the wall and sort of think through if they had to share personal information, let's say your sexual orientation with your parents versus your bank versus your university versus a stranger on the street, how would you feel on sort of a comfort spectrum? And then everybody would go up and put a dot on the wall and you'd see this complete spectrum of perspectives for sexual orientation. And then your savings bank account, everybody for that same set of stakeholders would have very different responses. And just having computer scientists who otherwise don't need to think about this messiness that we are all encountering every day through these types of activities, I found really rewarding, and they always said that they learned quite a lot by going through. And I had similar activities for almost every topic that we covered. Human rights, bias, that was a different one, even though I recognize that relates to human rights in some cases. But I just forced them to do activities that include physicality, and I hope it helps. That would be my thought. I don't know if you two have ideas how to train people.
I think that's an amazing question. I'm so happy to hear you're thinking about it. I'd have to give it some more thought, except I think that thinking about discrimination and what discrimination means in a societal context and how complex it is. I mean, learning the legal analysis for discrimination isn't necessarily going to teach you how discrimination, I don't think I'd bother with that, but in terms of your students, but learning sort of the empathy and sympathy of how discrimination works, I think would be really helpful. And then remembering that the data points are all humans, right? Just having humanity be a real constant component of the work that you're doing when dealing with numbers, that they are all people behind those numbers.
I say
Oh, sorry, Tony, you had a response?
not as good as these ones, so it's we can move on.
Thank you very much. My name is Andrew Samueli. My question concerns about the trustworthiness. That is the basic topic. We all trust what you say because we understand, but 80 or 90% of the population would know what you're talking about. And furthermore, there will be a lot of distrust against long words and lots of things. So I'm wondering how to educate the public, because it's a democracy. The larger number of people, decision makes decisions. If a demagogue comes on the scene and directed the public against whatever, because they did not understand what the technology entails, what artificial intelligence entails, what is the situation then? Like, I know it's impossible to say, but I had to ask it anyways. Thank you.
But I can start this off. I think maybe what you're alluding to is transparency of the usage of the technology. One of which I will say that, I mean, we haven't put much thought of at the end of the day. We put these systems together, and I mean, if this is public information in terms of people inquiring how the systems work, I think the underpinnings of what goes into a specific feature can be understood. I think in some of the other domains that we discussed today, in terms of getting information from Facebook, for example, or other news sources, maybe it becomes less obvious how that information came about. Maybe that's a transparency question at the end of the day. I'm not posing that as a potential solution, but that's kind of what I extracted from your question.
Yeah, I mean, you've really pointed out one of the great complexities in that if we do require transparency, what does that look like? And are they producing information that is understandable to a data scientist and an engineer? Is it understandable to a lawyer? Is it understandable to somebody who has just learned how to read? Like, is it, what format are we asking for this information in? And that's one of the, yeah, but, sorry, so you, everybody, talking about everybody who's sort of highly educated in their own domain, we still can't always understand what each other are talking about, right? Because we're trained in our own area. But one of the most important things about AI is to have it be multidisciplinary, right? You need, this panel, I mean, I really applaud people who put this together, because this is what you need to make AI work. You need the data scientist, you need the engineer. I like to think you need the lawyer, but not everybody does.
That's usually at the back end.
ChatGPT designed this panel.
My job will be obsolete soon.
But I mean, is the transparency just, I guess, discounting people's responsibility for checking the information that you're ingesting into your everyday life? I guess that would be my pushback on this. Why would it matter how the news source was created, as the example I'll use? Not automotive, definitely not automotive.
No, I mean, transparency goes to trust, right? So that goes to, I mean, our legal system, for example, we have an open court principle that anybody can go to court and anybody can access any court documents because the public is holding the court accountable, right? And that's sort of we trust in our legal system, and that's part of people. When people understand something, they're more likely to trust it. When the government makes a decision, people have, depending on what the decision is, some right to an explanation as to how that decision was made, right? And when you get a judgment from court, you typically have, depending on what the judgment is and how big the case is, an explanation as to how that decision was made. So that goes to the trustworthiness of it. But to your point, people have to understand, right, how it's explained, and there's a lot of debate over that too.
The only thing I'll just quickly add is that we at Insera operate on a trust but verify principle. So, trust what you're told, sure, but verify that it's actually true. And I would say that for people who are learning about automated decision-making technologies, anybody who's you said that people who aren't sort of in tune with these topics might struggle to have understood some of our discussion tonight. If they're starting to learn things online and they're encountering concepts maybe for the first time, I'd ask them to just look at multiple sources and verify that what they've read in one place is actually a helpful source. And hopefully they can go to their local computer scientists or their philosophers here at Western to get advice on.
I'm sorry, I just want to add one thing, because that's a good point Anthony made. And I think that coming from your perspective where you're building systems that most people don't understand, and we think we get on airplanes, we don't know how airplanes fly. And there's tons of examples of things we trust that we have no idea how it works. I think part of the reason we trust it is because we know there are laws and regulations behind it, right, that are making it trustworthy or safe.
My name is Peter Jadicki.
Thank you for your perspectives. Huge issue, of course. In the context of the question you were asked tonight, can we enhance the trustworthiness of AI? What about, what my suggestion that I'd like to hear your comment on is to try and tie it to individuals. Make a human being responsible for every single thing that the AI does. So when Ford, makes my car drive itself, I'm still the one that's responsible for it.
Right now.
Or if the lawyers decide, I'm not responsible because I'm not in the car, then somebody at Ford is responsible. No matter what AI does, it always comes down to one way or another to a human being somewhere. Couldn't we just pick that human being out and say, you're the one who's responsible for this? And then if they don't like it, then AI just has to stop.
I do have a thought, but, yeah, one of the things that I like about what you suggested is that there does need to be some sort of accountability mechanism. And, within PIPEDA right now, every organization that's collecting personal data is required to have a chief privacy officer who's somebody, you as a Canadian can go to and ask for your data. They're held accountable if there's any sort of breach. And we don't have some sort of similar mechanism for systems that don't involve personal information. What I struggle with is actually that a lot of automated decision-making systems have collective and community harm. So how do you negotiate who has been harmed the most and who should be held accountable for that? If these systems are developed by communities as well, as they often are, and practitioners who are developing different aspects of each system, is it really fair if there's only a bug in one part of a system to hold that just one person accountable for that if it's actually been developed by like 15 different software developers working on that component? These aren't things that I have a good answer to, but it does make me hesitant about wanting to make just one person responsible for the effects of the harms, especially because so many of these harms are communal in nature.
I wouldn't say specific to individuals, but I mean, this is tested in the automotive domain on probably a daily basis. I mean, there are several active cases right now involving automation. For example, Cruise with respect to GM, most recently in California. Tesla is often in the news. When there are poor outcomes using these automated technologies, I mean, this is ultimately challenged in the courts, right? Someone is injured. The question is, where does the responsibility lie? Is it with the driver of the other vehicle? Does the corporation that produced the technology, do they have some obligation here? I mean, this is not new, at least in the automotive domain, in terms of this being challenged.
No answer yet?
Right? It's on a case-by-case basis, right? So,
Give us another week. Come back.
I mean, I guarantee that if there's shown to be a failure in the technology that produced a poor outcome, that the entity that produced that, maybe not a singular person, is generally held accountable, right? And at least in a financial sense, right?
I mean, I think in our negligence liability analysis in lawsuits when people are sued over liability, a big issue is causation, and there's a big debate over who caused the harm. And we all know when a lawsuit happens, everybody gets sued, right? They sue as many people who could possibly be attached to the harm, and there's a lot of discussion over what went wrong. In driving vehicles, we have the owner of the vehicle, we have the driver of the vehicle, we have the insurance company, we have the manufacturer. In that way, there can be individuals involved. If maybe what you're suggesting is, if an organization is going to create a design AI or deploy AI, they should nominate somebody to be responsible for ensuring that AI is not going to cause harm. And I think that's an interesting question. And yeah, I think that's a different context than sort of the driving context.
Well, yeah, because if you think about it in the case of Facebook with its recommendation system, the harms are a huge group of people who encounter content that is radicalizing them or affecting their mental health or any number of other things. Allowing them to find out where to purchase substances online. The people who are responsible for making that content available on Facebook are the content moderators, the people who have developed the recommendation system, the people who have designed the interface to be so appealing to so many of us. It's not one person involved in those decisions, and then making just one person at the company accountable for that feels impossible as well because of the nature of where those different teams are situated within the organization. It's not like there's one chief responsibility officer who would be taken down every time it was shown that Facebook was causing harm. I think auto industry, it becomes like very tangible, how you can maybe think about who would go to court, but when you think about other automated decision-making systems, it gets very messy. But I love the thought of sort of experiment.
Dave Mitchell. I guess it's more of a maybe perspective than a question. Going back to your father's Commodore 64 handbook, kind of the rudimentary form of AI systems automation, where you have that question of how much time and effort you put into developing a process versus the that return on that investment and the time saving presents. If you take that perspective and say, I'm going to put this time and effort into fleshing out what the repercussions of not thinking about the regulation, but doing that legwork up front, but realizing that the full return on investment, of creating this AI system is still going to pay off in the long run. But you've tackled the hard questions on the outset, because you really do have this challenge of the torso of the hair of AI is moving so much faster than our legal systems and our human systems can really think, process the questions. Starting out asking the questions first and seeing if it can justify the rationale of things.
So, well, by all means, yeah.
So what I love about that is, I'm having been at the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, and also I consider myself a critical computer scientist. I'm a huge fan of privacy by design, so thinking about what you need to design into your system at the outset to preserve people's privacy. And I know a lot of other computer scientists will be like, oh, but it's so hard. It makes us think through all of these things. It slows down the development cycle. It means we have to delay our product. But it's fundamental to think about at the beginning so that you don't have huge issues as you roll your service out. In the same way, it's important to have a diverse set of people working on your development projects so that they can bring their different perspectives. It's not just all people from Silicon Valley who have been raised in privilege and think they're, that's what life is like, designing the system. You need a diversity of perspectives to be able to think through where harms might come from. The only challenge that I've actually encountered in the development projects that I've been involved with, like software development and tool development projects that I've been involved with, is that you can eventually, no matter how hard you think you have covered all of the potential use cases of your tech, no matter how much time you dedicate to that, because you don't know everybody, you can't think of all of the potential places your technology might be deployed, you don't know all of the conditions that might be in place when your technology gets deployed. It's really hard to actually get to every possible harm. And also what you perceive as a harm now might not be a harm in 5 years. What is in the realm of what counts as harm now might be different in 5 years, and conversations about those things change too. So what I find now in my current work is not so much that you want to just focus on building that in at the outset. You absolutely do want to try to. You also want to have iterative cycles where you're reassessing things. That's where these risk standards that Susie mentioned earlier are really helpful. They sort of help you think through the cycles that you should be going through as you're deploying a tool, to go back through and reassess it and be like, what haven't I thought through? What have I thought through and it didn't go as I planned, or what has emerged since then? So yes, I love your suggestion to start at the outset thinking these things through, but then keep doing it, because you will have missed things no matter how thorough you are.
Actually, what I heard from the commentary is what this needs is good systems engineering. So as we move in automation at least into the fully automated space where there's no human supervision, for example, we have a lot of startups working in the space, a lot of universities coming with algorithms that can drive vehicles. And then we get into the condition that Jason had mentioned. How do I know that I've tested this enough to be safe? We have software engineers then judging outcomes of scenarios when really we should be looking to, what does the law prescribe in these cases? But more importantly, what did you design your system to do to begin with? And usually the answer is, well, to drive. And it's like, well, at the top of if you guys are familiar with the systems engineering V, what were your requirements? And those are generally missing, and that's where the work needs to be done up front. That's where you have tools like failure mode analysis methods, for example. You have industry standards for like functional safety, for example, where you're thinking through what are the potential hazards I might encounter, what is considered reasonable, what is unreasonable risks, what are reasonable abuse cases, right? So that's why we have driver-facing cameras, so that you can't go into the back seat while the automation, right? It's reasonably foreseeable that someone's going to try to do something that they shouldn't with the technology. So what I'm hearing is that, I mean, AI is one part of this, but we can't ignore good engineering disciplines for bringing the technology to market. I have an open position, by the way, if you're interested in the system.
I forget the humor in my question and how I came up with it, but I have a secondary question to go along with this. So I put in the prompt, if you could ask an AI discussion board one question, what would you ask them? And ChatGPT responded with, as an AI, I don't have a personal preference or questions I'd like to ask. However, a relevant question for an AI discussion panel could be, what measures can we put in place to ensure ethical and responsible AI development and deployment, especially as AI systems becomes increasingly integrated into our daily lives. This question addresses the pressing need for ethical AI practices and responsible AI governance. Now, the second part that I have to this is in reference to the liability of human action of use of AI. The AI itself does not have a personal preference. Now, when we get into sentience, humans have biases because humans have preferences. So one of the cautions is if you see an AI that seems to have a personal preference, that could be cause for maybe not so much concern, but it brings about the question of sentience and whether or not that AI could be actually choosing things. Whereas the prompt is the human activator of this question. So whether it's a person designing it, a person using it, or just somebody who's in the sphere of influence, so if you're being detected by a street camera, you're activating that system. So those biases are created by people. They're not created by the AI until we have, a machine learning system that can produce those results. So, if I may, again, the question, what measures can we put in place to ensure ethical and responsible AI development, especially as AI becomes increasingly integrated into our daily lives?
Okay, I mean, there's a lot there. Thanks for all of that. I think that, well, bias in AI is complex, and you're right. It comes from the bias that we have as humans. And it comes out in various forms, either as the data that it's relying on has been collected in a way that is biased. Or it includes weightings and factors that are biased, whether either intentional by the person who's designed the system or completely unintentional, and the system has trained itself to find biases. But what systems can we put in place? There's, again, a lot of conversation about that. Two sort of popular topics of conversation now are impact assessments, which is one thing I'm working on in the human rights context, and that is assessing AI to see what its impact will be on the human rights. And to the other gentleman's question, it's designed in a way to apply to the life cycle of an AI system. It's at the beginning all the way through to monitoring it while it's being deployed. And then at the other end, a really popular thing that's emerging in various regulations are audits. So can we audit an AI system for the impact that it's having? And again, we have examples of impact assessments in the environmental context, and we can look there and say, Lots of companies are required to do environmental impact assessments. You can question how successful that's been or not, and then in the financial industry, we have audits, right? So we have examples of how that works. And do these audits need to be done by a third party, or can it be internal? And what are we auditing for? And there's a whole bunch of details to be figured out, but those are two emerging tools that people are looking at. And then we've had a lot of conversation about transparency. There's a lot of rules emerging about both disclosure when a system's used, and the transparency and the word explainability, where the system is explaining what it's doing. Another interesting thing that I like to think as a lawyer, I focus a lot on laws and rules and regulations, but it's not the only answer, obviously. It's a piece of the puzzle. Data scientists are well aware of the shortcomings, and they constantly are building solutions through technology. So there are lots of systems now being used to test AI for bias, and it's sort of technological tools that which I just find amazing, and sort of the opacity of AI, the fact that we can't tell what's happening. We'll try and find a solution. Now we're going to build an AI to go on top of that, and it's going to explain what the AI is doing, right? There's shortcomings in it, it's not perfect, but I love the fact that the technology industry is trying to solve its own problems, right? So it's, those are other tools beyond regulation.
I don't want to add anything to that. That was a brilliant answer. I mean, this is also an evergreen topic, right? Is the technology biased? Is it the people who design the technology biased? Is it the application of it biased? I mean, these are each of those questions could fill an entire hour and a half long debate. So I think Susie's answer.
Now you guys have me worried though. If we have an adversarial network that we use to query another network for bias, how do I know that the adversarial network isn't biased in and of itself, right? That's
Evergreen topic.
I'll jump in, just to Vanessa's point that she made earlier. In all of this is the question: what happens when our concepts of harm or bias or discrimination shift? Right? They shift regularly. How do we incorporate that? So this is like that life cycle, that iterative process. So you're talking about doing algorithmic impact assessments at the beginning of projects that you're putting in place. The audits may come later. I guess that's the distinction between those two, is that the audit is something that happens
Great question.
during or after. I don't know what the distinction is. But they could use the same algorithmic impact assessment to a certain extent to drive the audits, right? Right, yeah. Because the algorithmic impact assessment would be like a series of questions that you ask about identifying particular harms, and then there's some paperwork involved. And this is what the government's doing at the federal government, and the government of Ontario is developing their own as well. But none of these things address the need to monitor in an ongoing basis when our conceptions shift, right? Like ChatGPT will tell you that it has no knowledge of the world past September of 2021. So what happens if between September 21 and now something like Black Lives Matter erupts, and we have a completely different language that evolves around very important issues that we have to take into account? ChatGPT is oblivious to this in the non-knowing sense. Like it just can't provide any information about whatever has happened since 2021. Of course, like using that as an example. But I'll go to the next question.
A common use of generative AI that I'm seeing is people generating code for computer programming with the generative AI. Assuming that you can imagine it's not too much of a stretch that AI could be generating AI, it could be generating AI, and so on. Can you imagine a possible scenario of abstraction and complexity where we have to hold AI solely accountable for its actions?
So, when it is writing software code, it's writing software code that is very clearly defined. It's not like coming up with its own ideas for I'm going to make this script that'll go and copy all the photos that people have posted on Facebook. It's being told by a software developer, I'm working in C or C++ or one specific language, and I need to develop this sort of aspect of my program. I need this thing made, write that for me. And then you will copy the code that ChatGPT has created for you. You put it into whatever development ecosystem you're working in. You'll want to do some testing on it and see that it's not as buggy as the code that you personally would have written. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But it's not coming up with its own ideas. In the same way that it's not coming up with its own ideas for books or coming up with its own ideas for paintings. It's being given paintings, ChatGPT doesn't do that, Dolly and Midjourney, but like these tools, these generative AI tools, which is actually a phrase I hate and would also debate for an entire night, they are just responding to usually fairly clearly defined instructions, or maybe vaguely, in some contexts, defined instructions, and then giving you an output from that. They're not sitting around scheming about the world. They don't have that capacity. And I think that we are very far, if not impossibly far, from ever getting to a place where that would be different. There are limitations to the ways that our digital technologies can operate, and these are not sentient tools sitting around waiting just for somebody to come around and ask a question.
I will push back a little bit, though.
Go.
Because I was at IBM earlier this year, and one of the computer scientists there showed me what he was doing with ChatGPT. And he had set up multiple instantiations. They were speaking amongst each other, but with very directed goals to develop policy. And he had no idea where the policy was going and what direction it was taking, but it had been running for days. And every time he jumped in, he just kind of laughed and said, "This is amazing what's happening." And they would prompt each other to refine certain points and then think differently. Oh, what about, and it was just going on and on and on. So there's always a question of when the system is so beyond what you had originally intended for it to be doing in terms of the outputs that you wouldn't even recognize.
He had to jump in to see the policies. So somebody prompted one of the instances to start working on it, which was then directed to another instance, and it would have said, "What do you think of this policy that I've developed?" And it would have been like, "Here's some thoughts. What do you think?" And it's going back until a human intervenes. It's not like this policy is actually going anywhere and taking over a policy shop or anything. Like, there still needs to be human involvement, and it's still responding to a prompt. There's not one sitting on its own being like, "Well, now that I've developed this iteration of the policy, I'm going to make sure the EU gets a draft of this, and I'm going to read like."
As long as we build the oversight in, right? If you have an automated system that's making decisions about, say, trading on the market and just playing around with certain trends and looking for different ways of doing trading, you won't know necessarily what's going on. I'm just pushing back, and making decisions quite independently, and then all of a sudden, oh, the stock market crashed, we have to shut things down. I mean, this has happened, right?
Yes, but that's because we'd already trusted those systems to run the stock market. We're not trusting ChatGPT to create new software systems that are sentient and, oh, Jason.
We have about 8 minutes left. Just some hands. I have one here. Okay, any other hands?
It's Andrew again. I will push back too. It's a real simple example. In my schooling, in computer science, we learned that AI systems can write their own code. They can change their own code. For whatever reason, I never understood the concept of why it changes it, but that's what we learned. And what if a real simple system, car is driving down the road, oh, okay, the code changes because the data changes. So it's data driven. If it can counter the data element that is unknown to it or can be misinterpreted. If it's unknown, it doesn't know what to do. But it can be misinterpreted. For instance, car drives down the road, there's a traffic light, and the middle light is not yellow, not red. It's an unknown color because one of the red components burned out. It will make a wrong decision, and there will be a collision or whatever. It could be a collision. So that is one thing that an AI system can do on its own, and the human being cannot be responsible because they did not plan the data element to be there, that is there. So, yeah, the question that itself. Thank you.
Maybe I'll take this one here. I mean, is this coming down then to maybe less about the structure or the notion that these algorithms can produce additional algorithms? It almost sounds like there needs to be discussion around the cost function that is set up, right? So any of these methods, AI technologies, come down to what are you programming it to do? So ultimately, as we consider the ramifications on society or what needs to be regulated, maybe it comes down to this cost function as opposed to the specific structure of the algorithm itself. So the notion that it can produce code or make itself more complex is really just a, how many layers are in the network type of question. Whether there are multiple talking to each other, I think we get wrapped up in the structure, but really we should be focused on what was the objective of the algorithm in the first place. And then essentially the complexity in the input data, I think, would then give you some sense of what are the potential hazards that come out of that. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what comes to mind is what am I asking it to do? And I think this is part and parcel to what you were alluding to. So.
Thank you. Just want to thank you all for participating. This has really been fascinating. My name is Carolyn McLeod, and I'm a philosophy professor. So I just want you to maybe think a bit philosophically about trust and whether trustworthy AI is really what we want to be striving for. So trust is really relevant to circumstances of uncertainty. So if we know for certain that something is going to happen, we have no need to trust in anything. So if we're certain that someone is going to act a certain way, we don't need to trust them. So trust involves sort of leaping beyond the evidence and having some optimism that something is going to happen that we don't know for sure is going to happen. So, I mean, you seem to be suggesting that we should have more certainty around AI than we do now. So if that's what we should be striving for, is trustworthy AI really the goal, or is it something more like accountable AI, or right? I mean, it's become this buzzword, but is it really what we want to strive for? I just wonder what.
Well, I mean, my easy answer is the paper I wrote I titled Accountable AI, so I would lean toward that. And thinking of the sort of more big picture trust questions is a lot more complicated. I don't know if this is a fair analogy, but the idea that we trust in systems, and I guess I said this a little bit earlier, but the question would be, can we get to a trust in AI like we have in other systems we don't understand? Can we get there through regulation? Will we get there? And I think that's a question to be considered. We all trust this building isn't going to fall down because we have a whole bunch of building codes and regulations around inspection for it, right?
And design construction
we don't even think
as
about
well,
it,
right? Yep.
right? Design construction, we don't even think about it. And I know that self-driving cars are a new element, but we sort of trust the cars we're driving and are designed in a way that's safe and they're not going to implode while we're driving them, right? Because we know that there's regulations on that. So it's a question that you wonder, like, can we get there where we think AI is something to believe in the same way? I don't know.
By all means, I do have a comment on this, believe it or not.
I mean, in present day, I would like more distrust in automated decision-making systems. Frankly, I see way too much trust in them and in the marketing hype around them. At the federal level especially, I see ministers talking about how great sentiment analysis is, and sentiment analysis is snake oil. I would love to see a little bit more critical thinking about what these tools actually can do versus what we're being told by the companies who profit from them are telling us these tools can do. And if regulations can help us have more accountable automated decision-making systems, I would be happy with that. I don't know that I want to see a lot of trust in them. I think we have a lot of conversations to have about who benefits from these systems and who is harmed by them. And we need to have those conversations regularly in the next decade. And depending on those conversations and where regulations go, maybe we could have a little bit of trust in them. But I would actually appreciate a healthy amount of distrust, personally. Not speaking on behalf of my employer.
Fair enough. The commentary around trusting the products around us, so whether it be airplanes, vehicles, the buildings that we're in, and many of these regulations were after the fact. So there were, poor outcomes. We put regulation in place to make sure essentially that we're not repeating the mistakes that we made previously. I would argue that having discussions like this are worthwhile and to challenge the existing mechanisms to say, is there something special about this technology that's not currently covered? And unless you can find those holes, then I would argue that we should be trusting the existing mechanisms that we use to keep our products safe. And until we have an outcome that falls outside of that, then there's no need for preemptive regulation in this.
Well, I think that's good to, I think that's a healthy perspective and a good reminder. I feel a bit different in the context of human rights, because where we are now is we're leaving it, and first of all, most corporations out there are being good corporate citizens and they're doing their best to come up with internal responsible AI policies. I think one of the reasons they're doing that is because they know there are laws they have to comply with, and there's a bit of a fear of impending regulation. So I think the law is actually pushing them to do it, but I think there's a lot of good work happening internally with companies, but yet we're still in the space where what is fair is being determined by the corporations building AI, and I wouldn't leave our human rights analysis to companies. Like that's, we need to have a public entity that's a bit different in other contexts. I'm speaking specifically in human rights, but I wouldn't leave that at the hands of various companies, and they'll have different ideas of what discrimination means, and that would be one example.
On that note, I'm going to thank...
In 25 minutes, computer sessions will automatically end and public washrooms will close. If we need assistance, please see house desk staff now.
On that note, I'm going to thank our panelists, Vanessa, Susie, Tony, for what I thought was a great conversation. For you, I'm going to thank all of you for being here, for asking such stimulating questions. And if we could just get a round of applause.